Good evening, folks.
Good evening. Welcome to SDS Thursday. As you, at least those who are there with cameras on, I know that you all know that it is presented to you by SDS Seminars. We are a UK-based company, and these events are absolutely free. And we try to cover a wide range of topics. And recently we started also demonstrating various exercises. I think we can probably start now, Paul. What do you feel?
Definitely.
Today we will be talking about another exercise which you can use with your clients. It's called force field analysis. Paul will be taking you through it.
Fantastic. Let me just say a little bit about how I came across this and my sort of interest really in this. As I guess a number of you will know, I have a particular interest in poor client motivation and how you work with motivation with clients generally. That's within obviously motivational interviewing, but it also extends beyond that. And I came across this particular strategy or technique really in connection with that. So to just give you, first of all, a bit of background on it, because its background is relatively unusual and I guess maybe probably quite unfamiliar to at least many of you. I suspect that some of you, depending on your background, may actually in fact have some familiarity with Kurt Lewin, but for those of you who haven't, Kurt Lewin was an organizational and social psychologist. He basically, I can't remember when he actually died, but this particular idea that we're going to be looking at today, which he developed during the mid-1940s. If you're thinking to yourself, I don't know if I've ever heard of this guy, you probably won't have heard of him unless you've done some sort of work, probably in organizational psychology or organizational development, because his primary interest was in groups and organizations and how they functioned. And he was particularly interested in the whole issue of change within groups and change within organizations. And that's where this particular idea of force field analysis was first developed, which he first mentioned in 1943 and then developed further in 1954. So the basic argument behind this is that really, in order to fully understand the situation, and I'll include within this, because we're going to be looking at how this applies to individual clients, how one understands what it is that a client is trying to grapple with, or a client's current behavior or issue, is not just about focusing on the individual themselves, but also additionally looking at the context or the situation that they're actually in. And I think one of the things that I've certainly found useful from him is that he's interested in context, not just from the perspective of external context, but also from the perspective of perception of context as well. So this is an approach to understanding individuals, which I think sort of captures both of those and brings to bear the importance of an individual's subjective perception of what's around them, as well as actual objective factors that are operating on them. So his idea in many ways is very, very simple and straightforward. He argues that all behavior is determined by the balance of two opposing sets of forces. What he terms driving forces, which are basically factors that are around, which are, well, they can be conceptualized in a number of ways: pushing for change or suggesting change. But also it's important to bear in mind that he sort of sees these particular forces set in balance with what are called restraining forces. And restraining forces are basically factors that are around, which basically say the way things are at the moment, the status quo is okay. Now, what's very interesting about this is that this is a way of making sense, really, of any behavior or any position that any of us are actually involved with. Broadly speaking, if we're not aware of those two different sets of forces, the chances are pretty high that on the whole, we have very powerful restraining forces, which are so powerful that we're not even aware or have any consciousness of forces for change. And that also tends to mean, incidentally, that we feel very comfortable with the current situation. It feels normal, it feels fine, it feels like it's functioning. We feel happy with it. However, his argument is that whenever the prospect or the need or the possibility of change comes into being, it tends to create, to varying degrees, a sense of dis-ease. And the degree of dis-ease that any individual experiences is really a product of how these two opposing sets of forces are held in balance. I'll come back and indicate some metaphors to illustrate this a bit further in a minute. But I suppose the most important thing to bear in mind is, certainly with regards to our clients, the overwhelming majority of our clients by far are individuals who are not happy with their status quo. They're not happy with the way things are at the moment. And the implication of that with regards to this particular model is that when you are in that situation of feeling uncomfortable with your status quo, it suggests that basically driving forces and remaining forces are in tension. They're broadly equal with each other. They're not perfectly equal with each other because people still do what they're going to do at this particular point in time. So in that respect, the restraining forces typically are still stronger. But the argument is that if at the end of the day, we find ourselves feeling totally happy with where we are, it's unlikely that there are any powerful driving forces around. The good news on this is it suggests that the position that our clients are currently in, when they come to us and they feel unhappy in some particular way, suggests that these driving forces and restraining forces are in some form or other in precarious balance. In other words, these two opposing sets of forces are not stable. And that, of course, is what gives rise to our clients feeling a sense of dis-ease or wondering about whether change should be done or wanting to change but not sure how to do it, and so on and so forth. But the overall underlying assumption is that while the client is still doing what they're doing, still not doing what they would wish to do, but currently staying in the same position, the implication of that is that that is still the least uncomfortable thing for that person to be doing at this point in time. Please notice my phrasing here. It doesn't necessarily imply that the client is comfortable. It's just that the client is doing what they perceive as being the least uncomfortable thing. Okay, so we can apply this to practically anything. We can apply this, for example, you might want to have a think about this in terms of the fact that you're here this evening, for instance, engaging with this particular event. There will be certain driving forces that both brought you here and also which keep you here. But there are also certain sort of restraining forces that basically would be saying, let's get back to what I do normally. Let's see if I can, I don't know, maybe I've got something planned, maybe I've got a TV program to watch, maybe I'm seeing some friends or phoning somebody at a certain time, and so on and so forth. So the degree to which you come here and stay here is in a strange way in a sort of precarious balance. So why do I think that this is useful to actually be reflecting on and considering? Well, I think first of all, it provides a framework in which we can actually talk about the client's situation in a collaborative way. So we can recognize that actually we can say, I appreciate that you are doing or not doing X at the moment, but that you're not happy with things. And we can have a look at what it is that on the one hand suggests to you change would be a good idea, but on the other hand, the things that are around that are stopping it happening. But I would like to say that this was originally designed as a framework by which a practitioner would be looking at from the outside at an organization. In other words, it's not crucial with using this particular technique to necessarily be collaborative. So why I mention that is that if you have not got a collaborative client, it still has some value because it provides you, the practitioner, with maybe a different way of formulating or thinking about the problem that the client's actually got, which will provide you with suggestions about how you might actually change it. Secondly, I personally think this is of enormous value because it's a useful way of reframing stuckness. I think very often our clients, and maybe us, think about the client as being stuck. What this model says is that if your client is basically uncomfortable or distressed in some way, that stuckness is actually precarious. It's not solid, it's not fixed. It's actually in a rather unstable balance at the moment. And that by definition implies that if that imbalance could somehow be slightly altered, it may be enough to actually free up the client to then make moves which they need to make. So I just find it very helpful very often when I'm talking with clients who say, you know, I've tried to do something about this problem for years, nothing works, I go around in circles, I do the same thing time and time again. I initially just try to explain that if you are feeling uncomfortable with the way things are at the moment, it would suggest that actually things are a bit more fragile in a good way, a bit more imbalanced in a good way than one would initially think. And that there's actually, in a sense, what we might need to do is to actually only make small changes. So if you, I mean, there's a number of metaphors that are used for this, but if you think about the metaphor of scales, and that you have two equal weights on both sides of a set of scales, it doesn't really matter what the size of those weights are. So you could easily have a ton on one side and a ton on the other side. What's interesting is, of course, is that both we and our clients tend on the whole to focus on that side of the scales, which is the restraining bit. But interestingly enough, even with massive weights on both sides of the scales, you would only need a small additional weight to be put on the other side, the driving forces side, to unbalance it and enable change to actually occur. What I also like about this is that I think it's usable or addable to a range of modalities, in a sense, in many ways, independent of what those are, because I think that this potentially emphasizes both internal and external factors. And I think for that particular reason, it's adaptable and usable with a range of modalities. I'm more than happy to, assuming we have time at the end, to invite thoughts and questions on that. And finally, in my experience, I just think it's a great way of generating creative ideas for change. So if you're feeling as stuck as the client is, which is very often one of the things that actually happens to us, I think that this generates different ways of thinking about things, different ideas, which might make a difference and help the client to move forward. So this is typically sort of presented diagrammatically, really. And this is the most common way in which it's actually done. As you can see, we will have two lines in the middle, and whatever the current issue or the behavior actually is that the client is grappling with. Generally speaking, although it's not crucial, I think that this tends to work with the more specific and concrete the issue actually is. So in that respect, for example, my relationship with my mother over X, whatever X actually is, would work with this far better than, for example, attachment issues, which is much broader. I mean, you can use it with both, but I just think in my experience, you tend to get better results with making it as specific and as concrete as you can. I think it often helps the client to generate ideas. And basically, whatever that response is to that current issue, whatever the way it is that you're behaving in response to that current issue, which I've termed here current behavior, is something which is held in balance by driving forces and restraining forces. Now, the way this works is in two stages. The first one is to identify what the driving forces and the restraining forces actually are. And I'll be going through some questions that you can ask, but can I just say one of the reasons that we're running this evening is we are quite interested to see how much interest it generates and whether or not to run a longer training on this. So, if you do want to get into a lot more detail about the types of questions that are asked or what you do with the answers, it's always going to be helpful for us to know whether that will be something that will be more appealing in a longer format. Just pop something in the chat box, folks. The restraining forces as well are equally important to identify, and I'll take you through some of the questions with that as well. So let me just start off by just giving you a really simple illustration of how this might work with a client. So we've got an example here of the issue, or rather most likely the failure to actually complete a home practice as a therapy task. I appreciate that that's probably relatively modality specific, but I hope it gives you something of a flavor. And let's just assume that we have a client who is not practicing this or not doing something in connection with their therapy. So what we've actually got here, which will be largely in this particular example through a conversation with the client, is an identification of restraining and driving forces. One thing I would just add with this is, if you are going to do this collaboratively, which I think we're going to be able to do with the vast majority of clients that we actually work with, each of these driving forces and restraining forces has to make sense to the client. So although you and I might ask certain questions to elicit certain things, we might focus on certain areas to elicit information, we might even make suggestions. Basically, if they do not fall on receptive ground with the client, they would not be included. Okay. So these are only included basically if the client themselves perceives these as playing a role. And there's a reason for that, which I'll come on to later on. You can make some sorts of adaptations to these, by the way. Sometimes what you can do is to actually list the driving forces and the restraining forces, and we can ask the client how big a role they actually think they play in what's actually happening. And you can potentially reflect that in the size of the arrows that you actually put here. I've not bothered to do it in this particular instance for simplicity's sake, but it also, there's the potential here for a graphical representation of the perceived importance of each of these factors. So just to give you this particular example, which is pretty straightforward. So if we look at the driving forces that have been identified in this particular instance, hate how I'm feeling at the moment. Task is actually manageable on reflection when I think about it, and the therapist seems to know what they're talking about. Can I just say, I know I've already said it, but I'll say it again because I think this is very important. There is no judgment made by the therapist about what the content of these are. This is purely from the client's perspective. So we don't worry with this about whether or not we think that they ought to be motivated by these things or not. I mean, that's a whole nother area which if you're interested in it, come along to the motivational interviewing and beyond course that we run, which incidentally we're running again. I'm running again live for the first time in a few years, actually, I think sometime next year, but you can have a look at that later on if you want. On the restraining forces side here, the things that are stopping the client engaging in this particular task is fear of failure, not convinced it'll make a difference, and also forgetting to do it. Okay. Now, although this applies to a particular client, I would imagine any of you that have had involvement with clients where you do use therapeutic tasks outside of the therapy sessions will recognize these as pretty common reasons why folks don't necessarily do their particular therapy tasks as have been agreed. So that gives you a sort of basic graphical representation of how you actually do that. And then I've got another one here, incidentally, which is a different sort of metaphor to share with the client, because I think this offers something slightly additional. You've got exactly the same factors here, as you can see, exactly the same way, but it's just graphically represented in a different way. So I hope you can see what's actually happening here is that if you look at this as a tug of war, if basically driving forces were enough, they would pull the other side towards you. On the other hand, if the restraining forces were really that strong, the driving forces would just give up and move towards them. So in a tug of war situation, which I think is very much how I would often describe stuckness combined with dis-ease for the client, it's usually because these two opposing sets of forces, which are not leading to any movement, are in a way fairly finely and fairly equally balanced as well. So it's just another way in which you might want to graphically represent it. I just guess for me, I probably use this particular metaphor with certain groups of clients, probably use them with younger clients, possibly less verbal, more pictorially orientated clients. But to be honest with you, there are other metaphors you can use. Obviously, a set of scales would be another potential metaphor that you could use here. So there's a variety of options that you can actually look at. So in terms of eliciting driving and restraining forces, these are the sort of two basic questions that we start off with. If we're looking at restraining forces, and can I just say, my inclination, as it always is with motivational work, is to elicit from the client what it is that keeps them in the current position that they're in. Why is it that you're doing what you're doing at the moment? So in this particular example, with regards to the therapy task, the starting question would be, what sort of things get in the way of you doing the task? Okay. And we get different answers. Can I just say each answer is to be treated like gold dust? Okay, we do not attempt to get the client to elaborate on it. We don't get them to talk about it in detail. In fact, to be honest with you, we just wish to write it down as soon as the client mentions it. And then we say, and what else? And what else? And what else? And we try and do that basically until the client dries up, when they can't actually identify any further factors. Then we look at eliciting driving forces. And in my own experience, the most effective way of actually doing that is to actually play devil's advocate with the client, because we've just identified a whole range of things that are keeping the client, in a sense, stuck with where they are. So an interesting question to ask is, why not just give up? Why not just give up? Why not just accept that all of these things are going to mean that no change is possible? And to make an obvious point here, the fact that the client is there seeing you, the fact that the client is feeling a sense of dis-ease, that they're not happy with their status quo, would always identify the fact that there are things that are suggesting change for them, that are basically saying the status quo is not okay. Okay. And to actually make a move from that point. But I think very often you have to be that challenging with your client in order to actually elicit those driving forces. One final thing just to say about driving forces, and I know I've mentioned this already, but it's just so easily forgotten, I think, by therapists and practitioners. Do go with what your client is saying to you. Don't selectively ignore things that you think are less healthy. The reason why I mention this is that from a motivational perspective, as a general rule of thumb, on the whole, at the beginning, when people are motivated to make some sort of personal change, on the whole, they tend to be more motivated by the desire to avoid negative consequences than they are motivated by the desire for benefits. If you again come along to the MI and Beyond course that I run, if you're interested in exploring that more. But why I mention that is that although that's got problems in the medium and long term, to begin with, it tends to be the most powerful thing that tends to move people forward. People, you know, you could take any example with this, but if you take, I don't know, someone mentioned earlier on that they did couples work, for example. I can't remember the last time I worked with a couple where basically, if you were to say to them, why do you want to do something about this issue in your relationship? They said, we want to have a full flourishing relationship. No, yeah, I've never come across anyone that said that. I have come across people who are saying, I'm really worried my partner's going to leave me. So to begin with, negative consequences, or the avoidance rather of negative consequences, is often a much more powerful process for people. So don't be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, that sounds a bit negative, I'll reframe it as a positive thing or something like that. Do go with the way the client themselves actually presents that, and try to avoid a natural inclination to be judgmental. Now we then get to what I guess is one of the most sort of interesting or crucial issues, really, which is what we're going to do about this. So the whole point of this, can I just remind you, is to conceptualize the problem as one where we're looking to help the client become, I know this will sound slightly bizarre, more unbalanced regarding their current situation. We're looking at, by the way, some of you will probably have already spotted that there are some direct ideas here that are borrowed from systems theory. So if you're thinking about this sounds a bit weird, go and dip into some systems theory. It's not a particularly sort of left field way of approaching it. It just recognizes that in order for people to move, they have to actually, in a constructive way, become destabilized. So there's 4 ways that you can approach this. Are there any additional driving forces that could be easily added? Now, please notice here the phrase easily added. They need to be additional factors which are not going to be complicated or drawn out. It's the equivalent, if you come back to that balance on those scales, it's the equivalent of having 2 10-ton weights on either side, but actually someone decides to put a 10p piece on one side, and that's all that's required to shift the balance in that particular way. So again, we're looking for easy things here, which incidentally may not be the same necessarily, I hope you can see, as what you and I would see as being the most important things that would make a difference. They are the easiest things that will make a difference, because this is less interested in content and it's much more interested in process. So secondly, are there any restraining forces that could be easily removed? Now, again, don't assume that all restraining forces are very robust and set. Very often when you simply stand back from things, you can actually see that some of these restraining forces are actually things that can be changed, can actually be removed or changed fairly easily. Thirdly, are there any restraining forces where their significance could be shrunk? In other words, we can't totally get rid of a restraining force, but what we can do is we can make it smaller. Now, there's broadly speaking two ways of making any restraining force smaller. One is objectively making it smaller. So if, for example, actually let's go back and have a look at our example here. If we look here, if we look at something like forgetting to do it, okay. Now, we might, I don't want to teach you how to suck eggs here, but you do appreciate that the importance of addressing the issue that our client comes to us with is always at its highest when they're with us. As soon as they go out through the door, or as soon as they turn off their screen, they have multiple other priorities because they're human beings that crowd into their life. And also, change is not necessarily a particularly pleasant thing to be having to think about. So there's some degree of psychological investment in forgetting as well. So if we look at something like forgetting to do it, we're never probably going to totally take that away. But there are things that could be done in order to shrink it. Now, to just give you a very, very simple example here of something that will shrink this would be to plaster Post-it notes all over your flat or house regarding the particular thing you need to do. Doesn't get rid of it, and it's not designed as a panacea to the problem, but it's one of the things that might help to shrink that particular restraining force. Okay, just to give you an illustration of how that works. The other thing about shrinking restraining forces is, of course, we might not be able to objectively shrink them, but it may be that we can help the person to change their perception of the restraining force. So their perception of the restraining force is such that it becomes, in their eyes, less powerful or less overwhelming. So let me just come back to this. I guess that there's a number of things I could see that I might do here. But if we looked at fear of failure, for instance, one of the things that we could spend our time with our client on is looking at the various things in their life currently that they are competent at doing. We could look maybe at other things that they've previously achieved, despite the fact that those have been challenging for them. We could also potentially spend some time with the client looking at past failures and looking at how they're survivable. In other words, they're not catastrophic. Now, again, none of those are guaranteed to have a result, but you can see how the aim of those things is to help to shrink the individual's perception of the size of that particular restraining force. Thirdly, we can also look at the whole question of driving forces where their significance could be amplified. In other words, the significance of the driving force could actually be increased quite substantially. And again, can I just say, and I know, or I suspect that for some of you, what I'm about to suggest may actually seem counterintuitive, but I just know from experience that as long as the questioning is sensible and is sensitive, is actually very effective. I can see how we might use that with a driving force like hate how I'm feeling at the moment. I could simply have a conversation with my client about why is the way you're feeling at the moment because of this problem such a bad thing for you? And we could engage, for example, in some further laddering. If they say, well, I'm just, I'm ending up with all sorts of problems at the moment as a result of this, and I'm feeling quite overwhelmed by it. So I say, so for you, it's really important that you try and do something which helps you to get to grips with this, because you feel that actually you're having to juggle so many things, and that's really difficult at the moment. Yes, that's right. And can you just tell me why juggling so many things is bad for you? Well, if I'm honest with you, I'm just worried that, in fact, it's already happened. In fact, I'm just worried I'm going to drop some of these. I feel I've got so many balls in the air and I'm running around and it's exhausting. And I know I've dropped a couple already, and I'm really worried about dropping more. So for you, it's really important to do something which gets to grips with this, because at the moment you're feeling exhausted by the way in which things are going. You're worried about dropping things. And it's just, generally speaking, very difficult to carry on the way in which you're going. Is that right? Okay. So what is the single driving force? And the need for change, or the importance of change, is amplified in the client's perception. A lot of people, again, I feel tempted to get drawn into motivational stuff here. Can I say there are lots and lots of instances where all of us here have been motivated to do something because we are not happy with our status quo, and where, to be honest with you, we've not known when we've started off how we're going to do it. So what's led us to do those things? The importance of doing it. And in a strange sort of way, I think our clients, and us if we're not careful, get caught up in the idea that in order to overcome a problem, you need to know what to do, and you've got to feel confident about doing it. And I don't think that's true. The example I sometimes give about this is that if I and my son were walking down an alleyway at 2 in the morning and we saw someone coming towards us with a knife, if you were to ask me how confident I feel about dealing with that situation, I would rate it very low. If, on the other hand, you ask me to rate how important it is for me to actually deal with that situation, I would rate it extraordinarily high. And if you were to then say to me, well, Paul, before you can do anything, we need to find out how we're going to build your confidence to deal with this, I would say, no, you don't. And there's lots of instances where amplifying or recognizing the significance of the importance of something is often quite sufficient to enable people to move. So that's just, and can I just say that the simple examples I've taken here potentially can be replicated with every single one of these driving and restraining forces. And I mention that because, in a way, what this does is it generates a menu for action. Action on the part of the practitioner, and potentially action on the part of the client. And it doesn't, in a sense, require all of these things to work. In fact, in my experience, you typically don't know which of these things is going to make the difference. But if you have a range of things which you can do with your client, or which your client is willing to entertain as a possibility, this model would say very often you only need to find one which will tip that balance, which will cause, in that tug of war, the driving forces to be able to pull the other forces towards them for that change to occur. And I hope you can also see, as I'm sure you're aware, with all sorts of other methods that we use with our clients to help them to change, is that once change occurs in one small way, it feeds on itself. So actually what ends up happening is that confidence grows and further change comes off the back of it. So folks, we've sort of done this in a slightly different way. I don't even know, it looks like Julia's back. Sorry, Julia, I didn't know whether you were here or not, really. Why
don't you stop sharing, first of all?
Yes, good idea. There we are. So really, it's just an introduction to the idea. of this. I'm quite open to any questions at all. So if you're sitting there with yes, but, or what about, or what do you do if such and such happens, you know, just feel free, folks, to raise your hand, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
I can just say that Jane mentioned that she has a good example of this. So
all right, okay.
If Jane, you feel okay to just unmute yourself and share with us the example you've got.
Yes, I have a postgraduate couple as lodgers, and the lad, who I'll call Lee, has Asperger's, and essentially he can't really adjust to having another person about, which is me, and my behaviour has been perfectly okay. And they've come from, they're a youngish couple, and they've come from a shared household. So I suppose their thinking was to come to just a place with only one other person was an improvement. But he just can't adjust to this. And, you know, his behaviour is just dreadful. And in fact, while I was away, they've decided to move to their own place, which I think actually is the right thing to do. But I think that's a good example of somebody with difficulties in adjustment, working it through, and, you know, that's the conclusion they've come to.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, because I'm totally frozen and you're all totally frozen at the moment. But I can certainly hear you and you can hear me. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so we'll just carry on in frozen state as long as you can still hear me. I think that's a great example, Jane. I really do. And I think, you know, coming back to working with autistic folk, I think that writing things down in a fixed format, I think particular representations in this particular way are often an additionally useful thing to be doing, apart from simply talking about things verbally. And I think it's a good example that you took.
And can I just say that, having, you know, lived with someone with Asperger's for 3 months, it's actually very similar to bipolar, but on a sort of daily basis. You know, they're up and down, and they've poor attention, and they talk too much, and they're very, very poor emotional regulation. And I know sometimes the diagnosis for Asperger's is mixed with bipolar. They're not sure which it is. But is it really that when the mind is out of balance, you actually get the same sort of characteristics? And whether you diagnose it as Asperger's or bipolar or whatever, but it really strikes me that.
I certainly agree with you. I think there's a lot of overlap, and I think it's one of the reasons why you get quite a lot of both what are called transdiagnostic processes, but I think it also explains to some degree why you get misdiagnoses as well. You can still hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'm sorry. It's just yes. You're all totally frozen, so I'm not quite sure what's happening at my end.
We can hear you. We can hear you, Paul. And there's lots of thanks in the chat, but no other questions. So I think it's a good sign, because if you have a frozen screen, it maybe gives you a message that's probably time to come to bring this meeting to the end. Right. So thank you very much, everyone. We are not doing any Thursdays in December. We'll let you enjoy your pre-Christmas season. But we've planned Thursdays for the first 3 months of 2023. They are now on our website in the news category, but I think tomorrow you'll receive also emails with all the Thursdays planned for the next year, so add them to your calendars. Have fantastic festive season, and you can unmute yourself, say your goodbyes, and we hope to see you in 2023, if not at our courses before. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good Christmas.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.